Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second week of lecture for Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood Anderson. I have good news for you. This week's presentation will probably be, and certainly seem, a little shorter. There are a couple of reasons for that. One, we're not dealing with a new book this week, so all of the prefatory information you've already had. You don't need it again. Um, as we start to develop more of a common language in how we're talking about these books, I'm starting to feel comfortable with just hitting some main points about each story. But certainly, if this moves more quickly than you would like, or if I don't address something you're curious about, feel free to bring up the topic in the threads, or you can even email me directly with questions. So, this week's reading starts with A Man of Ideas, and this is the story of Joe Welling. This is a short story. In fact, I noticed as I was prepping, this section has several of these, what I call sort of palate cleanser stories, especially coming immediately after the big, sprawling, heavy story of Jesse Bentley and his family. Joe Welling and his short story sort of seem refreshing. Um, Joe Welling's problem, obviously, is that he talks and talks and talks. But he's very confident. He's very excited about things. He coaches the baseball team. He's an unstoppable force. And one of the descriptions of him is that the town of Winesburg, quote, sensing a tragedy, they waited, laughing nervously. So the suggestion is that they think that something about Joe Welling is going to lead to trouble for him, and they wait and sort of watch for it to happen, and they sort of laugh nervously. Now, on one hand, that sounds very callous, but on the other hand, this has always struck me as a very rural way of dealing with things. We sort of, I say we, I come from a rural background. I'm not currently rural, um, but rural people, if something makes them uncomfortable, uh, a first defense, so to speak, is often to try to laugh it off or minimize it. Um, but eventually, that gives way to more concern. Although not so much in the case of Joe Welling. And I'm curious, as you read, what did you make of Joe Welling? Um, Anderson talks in the book repeatedly about how the inhabitants of this town are grotesques. They're people who have clung to a truth, and that truth has sort of misshapen them, malformed them, made them into the sort of gnarled, twisted apples in the orchard. Um, is Joe Welling like these characters? Is Joe Welling a grotesque? He doesn't really have any tragedy that we know of. He doesn't have a particularly sad ending. In fact, things work out better for him than we could have hoped. Or is there something grotesque about him? I don't have an answer for you there. This is something we sort of, when I teach this class in person, we open it up to discussion, and people tend to have a lot of different ideas. So I'm curious what your idea is. If I don't ask you that specifically in the threads this week, feel free to bring it up. So the story Adventure, or the chapter Adventure, I've still torn myself on how to describe Winesburg. If it's a novel, then it has chapters. If it's a story collection, then it has stories. I think it's both, honestly. So you'll hear me sort of use that interchangeable language. But in Adventure, we learn the story of Alice. And before we get into Alice's story, there's this just almost easily missed line on page 85, where we are told, quote, Alice's stepfather was a carriage painter and given to drink. His story is an odd one. It will be worth telling someday. And if you are developing that ability to read critically, to read closely, and really parse out what every sentence is really saying to you, your reaction there was probably, well, wait a minute. If his story is really odd and interesting and worth telling, then why aren't we getting his story? Um, but his story isn't central to Alice's story. But this larger idea of the stories that we don't yet know, I would argue, is an important part of rural characterization generally, and it's an important part of why Winesburg is such a dense, fascinating book. There are always stories around every corner, not just the ones we learn of. Anderson, as I say on the slide, is always sketching in side doors that he doesn't open or explore, as if you're walking down sort of the alley behind Main Street in Winesburg, and there are doors that are closed, and you know things are happening behind them, but you don't quite know what. And again, what's the effect of this on you, the reader, on your overall sense of both the town and the novel and what it is that Anderson is interested in? I think one effect is that it creates a very rich tapestry or a rich background in front of which Anderson tells the story of Winesburg. Um, Not only are the stories themselves that we get varied and dense and complicated, but there are stories behind those stories that are really just shadows and suggestions that give us a sense of even greater depth, which, of course, is, I would suggest, a characteristic of not just rural places, but certainly rural places. The stereotype of the rural is it's a nice, rustic, simple place where nothing much happens. My reality, in my own experience, and certainly the reality of most rural literature, is that is not true. In fact, if anything, there are more secrets in small towns where everybody knows what everybody is doing or thinks they do because people have to work harder to keep those secrets. So, as adventure unfolds, we learn that Alice and Ned fall in love. Um, and they don't get married, but they want to leave Winesburg. And they want to. Ned goes to the city or says he's going to go to the city looking for work. And Alice wants to come with him even though they're not married. Um, Now, the cultural restrictions of the time would not allow them to live together in Winesburg. That would be unacceptable. I know it's really strange for us to imagine that in 2015, um, but it would have been. It simply wasn't done. But when Alice talks about going to the city with Ned, she says, even though we will live in the same house, no one will say anything. In the city, we will be unknown, and people will pay no attention to this, to us. Uh, so, a really important question here. What does this tell us about the view of the city in Winesburg? And also, to broaden the question, in rural places. What is the city to rural people, to rural cultures? Um, One of the things I get from this passage right away, and I'm sure you do too, is anonymity is possible in the city in a way it wouldn't be in Winesburg. The reason they can't live together in Winesburg without being married is because everybody knows who they are. Everybody would know where they lived. If they moved to Chicago, if they moved to one of the cities in Ohio, um, they would probably not be asked many questions depending on where they lived and who they did or didn't know. So the city offers anonymity. As we keep reading, we'll see other things that the rural people believe the city offers, and whether or not it does, sometimes they find out. But certainly for Alice, the city represents anonymity and a shield behind which she and Ned could be happy together unmarried. Adventure is also one of those stories in the book where there isn't a lot of plot. I mean, there's some. Certainly, will they or won't they get back together, although I think we know well before Alice does that they won't. Um, but it's a story more about a character than about a plot, about events that happen. And Alice, especially, because in some ways we get to know her well, in other ways we really don't, um, possesses a lot of symbolism or a lot of metaphor. And I think you know these literary terms, but certainly symbolism, as when we looked at the gravestones outside of Ethan Frome's house or the pickle dish that breaks, these are objects that are more than just what they literally are. They represent other things. And metaphor, of course, is just when one thing represents or is compared to another thing. You know, my love is a red, red rose. Well, love, which is an emotion, and a rose, which is a plant, aren't the same thing, but we understand the comparison. So, how do we read Alice as sort of symbolic or metaphorical of small town life more generally? Because I think she can serve as this type of symbol, this type of metaphor. For example, she runs naked through the street. Um, and this is a I mean, I guess that would still be a pretty big event today, but I can't stress how big of an event that would have been in 1917 in small town Ohio. So, how are we supposed to read her running naked? Is it just that she had enough? Or is the fact that she has been pushed to where that she's resisting the town's social norms symbolic of something? And more importantly, I'm sure you noticed, almost immediately after she does it, she has a very strong reaction to the fact that she has done it. So, what then is the reading or a possible reading of that reaction. Respectability is, I think, a story most recognized in the book Winesburg, Ohio, as containing maybe the most unpleasant character in the entire book. A guy named Wash Williams, who is sort of a filthy, dirty, repugnant man physically, but his ideas are, I think, in some ways equally repugnant. I think the irony is not lost that his name is Wash, when that seems to be something he hasn't done recently. Um, but it says Wash William did not associate with the men of the town in which he lived. In other words, he didn't associate with the men of Winesburg. So more isolation. We've seen isolation, rural isolation in Ethan Frome. We've seen it throughout Winesburg so far. But this is different. How is this different? It's not a town being isolated from the larger world. It's not a family being isolated behind its doors to deal with its private affairs. It's a man choosing to really not associate with the other men of the town, with the exception of George Willard, who everyone, of course, talks to in Winesburg. Um, the central issue, I would say, of respectability is Wash's attitude toward women. It is unpleasant. I would say, taken at face value, it's repellent. Um, but usually, especially when you take the whole of the novel and you realize that this is not something that Anderson is up to elsewhere, it begs the question, does Anderson just want Wash to be repellent, or is something deeper going on here? Is there something about Wash uh, and his grotesqueness that Anderson is commenting on? What is, in other words, the truth that Wash has clung to at the expense of all other truths? And to continue the thought from the previous slide, I'm going to jump to the second bullet point first here. The ending of this story is probably one of the more memorable endings, certainly one of the more unusual. His wife, when he was younger and did not live in Winesburg, Wash's wife cheated on him. And we assume in an attempt to save the marriage, his wife's mother sends her naked into the room. And Wash's reaction to this is not attraction, it is not uh, anger, he doesn't try to solve the problem of the cheating wife. He tries to kill the mother with a chair for treating her daughter this way. So, for all of his repugnance, Wash seems to latch on to the real horror of the situation. The horror is not that his wife has cheated on him. The horror is not that she doesn't love him even though he seems to still love her. The horror is that the mother would think this is the way to solve this, and the absolute debasement and demeaning of his wife. So yes, old bitter Wash hates women and wants nothing to do with them and tells everybody he knows to stay away from them. But is that because Wash is a jerk, or because Wash is carrying the sort of, I don't know, psychological scars, I suppose, of this admittedly difficult moment? How do you interpret this ending? And how does it affect your reading of the story as a whole? Is Wash Williams just a repugnant, dirty jerk, or is there something else to him here? And how does him being a grotesque and clinging to the truth you see him clinging to affect that reading of Wash? Now, just to jump quickly back, I mentioned this on the first slide. Um, as always, the person who doesn't talk to anybody, think Wing Biddlebaum here, um, will talk to George. The quote is, "Something George saw lurking in the staring eyes of Wash told him that the man who had nothing to say to others had nevertheless something to say to him." So again, George is special. George is the confessor. George is the listener. George is the reporter. Why is this so important to this novel? We've talked about it before, but I just want you to keep considering it as we again and again see George fall into this role. Okay, so let's move on to The Thinker, which is, I would argue, at its core, a fairly juvenile story. And I don't mean that in the sort of dismissive, not worth anything way that that word is sometimes tossed around. It's literally a story about a couple of juvenile boys and the jealousies that come with being young boys and how they think about young girls. Um, it's sort of one of the more direct coming of age stories in the book. And it's really about Seth and Seth's thoughts regarding George and Helen White, and how, once again, the inability to communicate, the inability to say what's really on your mind and in your heart, leads to an inability to really understand each other in this small town. So we start with sort of a little bit of Seth's history, and we learn that his father probably wasn't a good man, but Seth's mother has established a memory in which he clearly was a good man. So the reality, the truth, and remember in this novel, truth is a particularly loaded word, is secondary to image and peace, right? It creates the best sense of Seth and his mother for the created truth to be that his father was a good man, even though he probably wasn't. And it keeps the peace. It keeps people from asking questions. And it's not that other people probably don't know that he wasn't a good man, but now that he's gone, uh, there's sort of I think, somewhat uniquely rural attitude of, well, let's just remember what was best about him, and let's sort of embrace this constructed, fabricated truth to keep the peace. Uh, I often argue when I do my creative writing and I write about small town Indiana, um, one of the themes I come back to is that in rural places, especially in the rural Midwest, and the Midwest is particularly bad about this, I think. Um, the truth is secondary to appearance. All right. There's a stereotype of rural people being very honest and direct, but really that's not always the case. Um, Keeping the peace, keeping everybody happy, keeping conflict reduced, I find, is more important than airing all of the dirty laundry or casting light on all of the dark shadows in a particular town. Um, and we see that represented here. So eventually in this story, we get to a passage where Seth is sort of fed up. And we get this. Seth arose from his place on the grass and went silently past the men perched upon the railing and into Main Street. He had come to a resolution. I'll get out of here, he told himself. What good am I here? I'm going to some city and go to work. I'll tell Mother about it tomorrow. Now, at first, this just seems like a teenager being a teenager, angsty, dramatic. Um, but once again, we see the fantasy of escape from the rural to the urban. If I could just get out of this place, things would be better. Ethan Frome believes this. Huckleberry Finn believes this. Characters in Winesburg that we've already seen believe this. As you continue to read, you will find that to some extent, although not in such a negative way, George Willard believes this. Um, so, what's the appeal here? Why? And I'm going to just go ahead and establish that this is a type in rural literature. Start looking for this character because this character will show up again and again. Why is this character so appealing? Is it true? If you can just get out of a small town, does everything get better? Or is it simply the effect of rural life and its sort of relative lack of distraction and entertainment and opportunity that makes people assume that's the case? A little bit later today, we're actually going to see somebody that did exactly this and how that worked out. Ultimately, the story of Seth and the story of the thinker is, as I said earlier, a story of adolescence. But it's really about the awkwardness of adolescence. For example, Seth is not a deep person. He's not a deep thinker. But people think he's deep because he's quiet. Outward appearance, especially in a small town where everybody knows everyone, can very quickly help define someone. And they become known for it. Seth is deep because Seth is quiet and he must be thinking. Another example, George Willard likes Helen White, but he doesn't realize that Seth does. And Seth and Helen can't quite communicate when they have a chance. As a result, Seth resents George at the end, even though George hasn't really done anything wrong. George doesn't even realize that Seth likes Helen. I realize this is all starting to sound like an episode of Grey's Anatomy, but if you can look past the sort of soap opera surface of this, what this story is really commenting on is what Anderson, especially we learn in the introduction, but also in the Book of the Grotesque, is interested in here. People, men and women, boys and girls, they can't really communicate. Whatever is in their hearts and minds, they just can't quite get out in the same form. And this story begs the question, is this unique to youth? And how do you think this might be applicable to all ages in Winesburg? Remember also that in the Book of the Grotesque, the suggestion is youth keeps you from becoming a grotesque. Something about being young keeps you from it. So are George and Helen and Seth still avoiding grotesqueness here? Okay, another sort of palate cleanser is the story Tandy. It's such a short, sort of, I don't want to say plotless, but certainly more ephemeral story that I've dedicated a grand total of one slide to it. And I'm not even really interested in what happens. All that happens is a drunk man stumbles in front of the house where uh, this man and his young daughter live, and the man, in his sort of stupor, tells Tandy that this is her new name. Her name isn't Tandy yet. He names her Tandy, and she goes with it. A little odd, really. Um, but I always like to zero in on this one sentence. The two sentences, I guess it is. Wait, one, two, there are four sentences. Clearly, I need better glasses. I'm a lover and have not found my thing to love. That is a big point if you know enough to realize what I mean. It makes my destruction inevitable, you see. There are few who understand that. What does this mean? This to me is the sort of fortune cookie wisdom of this story. Um, and I don't think it has one meaning. I don't think you can decode it and say, yes, that's the right answer. But he's obviously commenting on love and how love somehow sort of protects you from destruction. His problem um, is that he hasn't found it, but his bigger problem is that he realizes he hasn't found it. Um, what does that mean, and why is that so bad? Okay, now moving on to the strength of God, which, along with the teacher, is sort of the other two fairly intimately linked stories in the collection. You had the Jesse Bentley tetralogy or quadrilogy, I guess, the four stories relating to the Bentley family. The strength of God actually doesn't relate to an individual family. What it relates to, along with the teacher, is the same story told from two different points of view. So in the strength of God, you have Reverend Curtis Hartman, who is sort of in a rut spiritually, whose sermons are not very interesting anymore, and he discovers one day in the, I think, the upstairs of the church, there's a small chip missing piece in one of the windows of the church, and through it he can see um, Kate Swift, the teacher, and he begins to be sort of a peeping Tom, and he sort of watches her and is sort of surreptitiously excited by this, and sort of really becomes a little bit uncomfortable for the reader. Um, and then ultimately, when he sees her having an emotional reaction one night, he has an epiphany, and he believes that he has come closer to God than he's ever been, and he runs excitedly down the street, main street of Winesburg, and something has been accomplished for him. So, some things to point out about this story, and I only have the one slide on it. Um, First of all, the small town pastor is certainly a type in rural literature and culture. I think in some ways he or she is also a stereotype. Although I think Curtis Hartman sort of breaks that stereotype by sort of not doing what you might expect a pastor to do in more than one way. Um, and that's a question to ask. To what extent does he fit that expectation? I think he fits generally, but he also challenges them by sort of some of his choices, but also his epiphany. Um, a question for you, though, at the end of this story. Does Reverend Hartman find what he needs? He has obviously found something at the end of this story. Is it genuine, or is it a sort of justification of his behavior? Or sort of put this another way, if we believe that Reverend Hartman is a grotesque through most of this story, is he still a grotesque at the end of the story, or has he broken free of the truth that he clung to? And on the flip side, we have Kate Swift in The Teacher. This is the story of the person that Reverend Hartman was watching through the broken glass. So we get a different perspective on the events of another story, and that's really the only time this happens in Winesburg. And anytime something is sort of unique in a text, you sort of have to ask yourself, well, why? Why is this important? And I think Kate Swift, among other things, represents or symbolizes the sort of struggle or the tension between appearance and reality in small town life, or of what the introduction refers to as interiority versus exteriority. I made that last word up, but the idea of what people in the small town let us see versus what they think and feel and believe sort of internally. It's sort of the extreme version of what I said earlier about how, there's isolation within walls of a house, right? What happens in a family's house, people might think they know what happens in there, but they don't. And that's true of almost any family, unless it's a reality TV show, I guess. Um, but even more personal is what a person, what an individual lets people see and think about them versus their own hopes and dreams and hurts and fears and all of those things. And in a small town, it can be almost, in Kate Swift's case, a process of self-preservation to keep a lot of that to herself. And the only person that she thinks might get her and what she values is George Willard. And she has this moment where she has to sort of try to connect with him in this way to help him see that, as she sort of believes, there's a bigger world out there, and that he might be somebody that can understand and appreciate that. And the quote is, she took hold of George Willard's shoulders and turned him about so that she could look into his eyes. A passerby might have thought them about to embrace. Uh, and ultimately, George doesn't get it. He is still young and immature and male and hormonally driven enough to misunderstand what Kate Swift is trying to have happen here between them. And then she runs off terribly upset by the whole thing, and that's what the Reverend sees, and that's how the stories tie together. But this sort of thing, looking into somebody's eyes, reaching out and grabbing them or touching them, and trying to get them to understand something, this happens a few times, both in this story and I would argue in the larger novel. Wing Biddlebaum, for example. Very different sort of thing, but Wing simply was a gifted teacher who could reach out and sort of connect with his students and touched them sort of as a byproduct of connecting with them until his student made up the story about him. So is this similar? Certainly, Kate Swift is also a teacher. George Willard is also a student. Or is this a different situation? What's the connection here? How is the symbolism similar or different? And finally, in this week's reading, we have Loneliness, the story of Enoch, which is also a biblical name. I'm sure you've noticed there are a lot of biblical names. It's always fertile ground to sort of compare the name of the character to the biblical character the name is based on and see if there are connections. I don't know that there is in the case of Enoch, the biblical character, but you could certainly look into it. So Enoch leaves Winesburg, one of the few characters that we see in this novel that leaves Winesburg, Ohio. And not only does he leave Winesburg and go to the city, he goes to New York City. He goes to the city. When he's 15 years old. When he was 21, he leaves and is a city man for 15 years. He studied French, went to art school, tries to become an artist. Very unusual life path for someone from Winesburg. Very unusual generally. And how does this differentiate him from the other Winesburgians in the story? Well, certainly we have a lot of people. We have people like Kate Swift who left shortly but came back and was very unsatisfied. We have people like Seth who want to get out of Winesburg and swear that they're going to. But Enoch leaves and stays gone for a long time, years and years, a decade and a half. This is also one of the few times we see the city characterized directly. Winesburg, as a novel, spends a lot of time talking about a city that isn't the setting. People talk about going to the city. They talk about going to Dayton and Cleveland and Chicago and New York, but they normally don't. Enoch goes. And we see the city through Enoch's eyes and through his narrator's eyes. And my question for you is, how would you describe that characterization? Does New York seem like a bustling, happy place? Does it seem like the fulfillment of all the dreams of the city that these characters seem to have? Or does it seem somehow less appealing, less satisfying? So Enoch is an artist. And people come and look at his art. And the art that he works on in his apartment, people come and look at it. And there's a passage, I haven't quoted it here, but basically, Enoch wants to explain his art to people. He wants to make them understand it correctly. None of them seem to get it. But every time he starts to explain it, we realize that his upbringing in Winesburg is his key to understanding both art generally and his art. And that he can't communicate to his city friends. He can't explain how he sees Winesburg in his artwork. First of all, why not? Well, because they're not from Winesburg and they don't know Winesburg. But the bigger question is, what does this signify? And I think one possible answer is the inherent value of coming from a rural place to a rural person who grew up in that culture, and how even if they leave, that can never leave them, and it really defines who they are. And I think this is true both in literature generally and certainly in this book, but I think it's also culturally true of rural upbringing. I mean, if somebody grew up in a small town, generally they will talk about that effect. Now, sometimes the effect was a negative one, sometimes it was a positive, often it's sort of a mixed bag. But certainly all people are products of where they were born and raised. But rural locations tend to be more idiosyncratic and be more unique and have a more unique stamp on the individual, I think, in a lot of times than sort of cookie cutter suburbs or sort of overwhelming cities. Not that they don't have their own unique personalities. New York and Los Angeles are not the same just because they're cities. But there's a broader variety of flavor and characteristic and culture in rural communities, I think, that do sort of imprint themselves on these characters. And finally, you have made it to the last slide. Only 15 slides this week. The final thought on Enoch. And we're back with old Enoch. And I think sometimes when people read Loneliness, they miss the fact that this young Enoch that's in the apartment in New York, in the city, very different from the Enoch who is living in Winesburg at the time that George Willard is reporting for the newspaper. This is old Enoch, sort of very old. I don't know, I don't recall off the top of my head if the story gives an age, but not sort of in his 30s or 40s or even 50s. I get the impression he's older than that. So this experience in New York City was probably far into the past, probably in the late 1800s. And now, at this time, sort of after the turn of the 20th century, it was past 11 o'clock that evening when old Enoch, talking to George Willard in the room in the Hefner block, came to the vital thing, the story of the woman, and what drove him out of the city to live out his life alone and defeated in Winesburg. Now, you read the whole story of what happens with the woman, but I always am intrigued by this question about Enoch. Did he move back to Winesburg because he was defeated, or was moving back to Winesburg what defeated him? Think about that question. Did he get defeated in the city and then retreating to Winesburg was his only recourse, or was the actual act of moving back to Winesburg what caused his defeat? And the reason I ask this is because there is, I think, a sense that if somebody leaves a small town to go make it in the big city and they don't, returning home to the small town is the sort of admitting defeat. And I don't know that that's true. In fact, I would reject that belief, but it's a persistent idea. I've seen people go to the city and then come back and do great things in small towns because of what they gained in the city or what they learned or expertises that they developed. But if the character type of the person who wants to escape the small town for the city is common, then escaping becomes sort of representative of success for that character. So then would returning home, not being able to stay escaped, so to speak, be a failure? Would that be the defeat? Obviously, I sort of question that interpretation, but it's an important question when it comes to Enoch. So we've made it 2/3 of the way now through Winesburg, Ohio. We are taking Winesburg fairly slowly. You will certainly have larger reading assignments coming up after Winesburg, but partially because Winesburg resets itself so much and every story is sort of a new thing to understand and learn about, unlike
a more traditional novel. We're going to read Bless Me Ultima in a few weeks, and the reading is going to be more sizable for the 2 weeks that we read it, but it's because it's all one story. It follows one character and his family and other minor characters. So it's easier to sort of tune in and keep going, whereas Winesburg forces you to stop and reconsider fairly often. It's one of the great uh, attributes of Winesburg, I would say, but it does take some time, and I didn't want to overwhelm you early in the semester. I wanted to sort of get a sense of the rural. Plus, every one of these stories you could talk about in great detail, so you want to give the novel time. Okay, thank you all for listening this week. We will finish up Winesburg next week.